I booked the Airbnb in Sedona because I wanted peace. I had been working remotely for over a year, and I thought a few weeks away in the desert would help me reset. I pictured myself waking up early, making coffee, and working with the red rocks glowing outside the window. The listing looked perfect. Small casita, private entrance, fast Wi-Fi, and a little patio that opened out toward the scrub. The reviews all praised the host, Eric. They called him welcoming, helpful, friendly. Some even mentioned fruit baskets and little touches that made the stay memorable. I had stayed in dozens of Airbnbs before, so I didn't think much about it. Eric was exactly what the reviews promised on the first day. He was middle-aged, tan, and carried himself with the energy of someone who loved to talk. He met me in the driveway, helped with my suitcase, and brought over a basket of fresh fruit and a jar of honey. He pointed out hiking trails, told me where the best grocery store was, and waved me off with a smile. His cheerfulness came across as genuine, and Sedona felt safe. I didn't think twice when he said he liked to check in every so often to make sure guests are comfortable. On day 2, I was on a Zoom call when I heard a knock. I opened the door, and Eric was standing there with towels. He said he thought I might want fresh ones. The ones already hanging in the bathroom were barely touched, but I took them politely. He lingered in the doorway, asking about my work and about my dog, something he must have picked up from the brief conversation we had earlier. My dog wasn't even with me on this trip, but he wanted to know her name, her breed, her personality. It felt a little strange, but I brushed it off. He left after 5 minutes, and I went back to my meeting. The next day, it was something else. He knocked again and said he wanted to check the water pressure. I sat on the couch with my laptop open as he walked straight into the bathroom. He came out a few minutes later, smiling, saying it all looked fine. I told myself maybe he was just one of those hosts who went above and beyond. But the visits didn't stop. Every day he came by, sometimes more than once. Banana bread he had too much of, a hummingbird feeder he thought would brighten up the patio, casual chats in the evening when I was cooking. At first, the reasons seemed harmless. But after a week, I realized he had been inside the casita more often than I was comfortable with. The feeling started to sink in when I noticed little things. I came back from a hike one afternoon and found the blinds angled differently. Another time, my phone charger cable was stretched out across the counter instead of coiled neatly by the outlet. A bottle in the fridge was sitting on a different shelf. It wasn't dramatic, just small shifts you only notice when you live alone. I tried to rationalize. Maybe I had moved things and forgotten. Maybe I was tired from work. But then I started taking photos before leaving. I would snap a picture of the kitchen counter, the blinds, even the shoes I left by the door. By the second week, the photos told the truth. Things were moving when I wasn't there. I thought about messaging Airbnb, but I hesitated. What would I even say? That the host was being too attentive? That my blinds were tilted differently? He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't damaged anything. Technically, all I had were suspicions and photos of moved objects. Felt like my word against his. So I stayed quiet and tried to keep my routine as normal as possible. The night it broke was April 14th. I had been working late, finishing a project. Around midnight, I closed my laptop and stretched out on the couch, letting a show play quietly on my headphones. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was 2 a.m. I woke up not from a sound, but from a shift in the air, like something was off. I pulled off my headphones and sat still. That was when I saw the patio door. I always locked it, but now it was open by an inch. The curtain moved with the breeze. My chest tightened. On the counter, a dish towel I hadn't touched was laid out flat, perfectly aligned with the edge. I didn't move. My phone sat charging on the coffee table. Slowly, I reached for it and dialed Airbnb's emergency line, whispering into the phone. The person on the line told me to call 911 immediately. The police arrived quickly. Sedona is small, and the officers pulled up within minutes. They searched the casita, shining flashlights into the corners. They found no broken locks, no forced entry, just the slider unlocked. They asked if anything was missing. I walked through each room, opening drawers, checking the fridge, the bathroom, my suitcase. Nothing was gone. But nothing was the same either. Shoes shifted, blinds adjusted, items too precise to be accidents. One officer asked if I knew the host well. I explained about the visits, the towels, the bread, the feeder. I told him how often Eric had come by. The officer's face changed. He told me I should leave that night. No hesitation. He said it calmly but firmly, like it was non-negotiable. I packed fast. I didn't fold anything, just shoved clothes into the suitcase, grabbed my laptop, charger, and toiletries. My heart was racing the whole time. Every sound outside made me freeze, thinking he might walk in again. Within 20 minutes, I was driving out of the driveway and onto the dark highway. I checked into a hotel by the interstate at nearly 3 a.m. I double-locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and slept with the lights on. The next morning, I saw a text from Eric. He said he must have left the patio unlatched when he dropped off a towel last night. That was the explanation. No apology, just casual, as if it explained everything. I didn't reply. Airbnb refunded the unused nights after I explained what happened. But they didn't remove the listing. Weeks later, I looked it up again, curiosity pulling me back. It was still there. Same photos, same glowing reviews. But buried halfway down, one review caught my attention. It said the property was beautiful, the view amazing, and the host was very attentive, stopping by every day to check on things. The guests wrote it off as too much but otherwise fine. That word stuck with me. Attentive. People meant it kindly, but I knew what it felt like when attentiveness turned into intrusion, when kindness masked control. Now, whenever I stay somewhere new, I take photos of every room before leaving. I wedge a chair under the door at night. I don't care if it seems paranoid. I learned in Sedona that locks only matter if you're the one holding the key. And once you see the signs, you can't unsee them. When you work night shifts in an ER, you get used to two things: exhaustion and improvising. You learn to roll with whatever's right in front of you. A serious injury rolling through the doors at 3 o'clock in the morning, a broken vending machine when you haven't eaten in 12 hours, a patient screaming at you because they've been waiting too long. Whatever it is, you adapt. That same approach carried into how I travel. I don't need things to be fancy or perfect, just functional. As long as I can get a shower, a bed, and a door that locks, I can survive just fine. Last summer, I took a 6-week contract in Tulsa. I needed a place close to the hospital, quiet enough that I could actually sleep during the day, and clean enough that I wouldn't have to worry about roaches crawling into my scrubs bag. I pulled up Airbnb and scrolled through the usual mix of outdated apartments, basement suites, and overpriced downtown lofts until I landed on a small bungalow. The listing called it cozy, had some decent reviews, and showed a bright little kitchen, a plaid couch in the living room, and a bedroom with plain white sheets. Nothing remarkable, but good enough for what I needed. The host's name was Greg. He sent me the code the night before check-in, told me to make myself at home. Everything about it felt normal, which was why I didn't think twice about driving over there straight from my shift. It was one of those scorching June days where the heat seems to seep out of the pavement. By the time I pulled into the driveway around 6 p.m., the steering wheel of the rental car had felt like a frying pan. The neighborhood looked quiet and ordinary. Small houses with trimmed lawns, sprinklers ticking away, dogs barking at me from behind chain-link fences. I punched in the code Greg had given me, heard the deadbolt slide back, and pushed the door open. The blast of cool air felt like heaven after the heat outside. But then I froze. There was a man standing in the kitchen. He had a glass of water in his hand, like he belonged there. Jeans, faded t-shirt, short buzzed hair, mid-40s maybe. His presence didn't match what I'd just walked into. I had the code. This was supposed to be empty. I didn't say anything right away. My ER brain switched into that strange alert mode where you clock details automatically. He held the glass in his left hand. His other hand was empty. He was close to the sink. Distance to the front door, 12 feet. My bag was still on my shoulder. I finally asked who he was. He smiled, casual, like I was the one overreacting. Said he was Greg's brother. That didn't line up. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through the Airbnb messages. No mention of a brother, no mention of anyone else. Just Greg, the code, and the note to make myself at home. Something about the man's calmness made my skin crawl. He wasn't apologetic for being there. He didn't act like he'd been caught sneaking in. He acted like I was the guest in his house. He even made a comment about how Greg had told him I worked at the hospital and would want peace and quiet. That part really set me off. My Airbnb profile doesn't say what I do for work. I hadn't told Greg about my job either. I stepped back outside, shut the door, and stood in the driveway with my phone in my hand. I texted Greg, "There's a man in the house. Says he's your brother. What's going on?" The little dots appeared, like he was typing, then disappeared. Nothing. Inside, I saw the man move into the living room. He peeked out the window, then pulled the curtain halfway closed. That was enough. I got back into my car and called Airbnb support. At first, the rep sounded like she'd heard it all before, bored even, until I said the words unauthorized person in the rental. Her tone changed fast. She told me to leave the property immediately, said she'd escalate the case. 15 minutes later, Greg finally texted back, said it was just his brother Steve, that he helped with the place sometimes. Told me not to worry about it. That did nothing to ease my mind. His listing said private guest suite. Nothing about roommates. Nothing about a brother who apparently had free access. I drove straight to a cheap motel that night. The AC rattled like it was on its last legs, and the sheets were rough enough to feel like sandpaper, but at least nobody else had a key to my door. I barely slept, every noise outside making me sit up, but it was better than sitting inside that bungalow with some stranger pretending everything was normal. The next morning, stubbornness got the better of me. I wanted my bag back, and part of me wanted to see the house in daylight, to confirm I wasn't just overreacting after a long shift. When I drove up, the blinds in the front window were open. My bag wasn't on the counter anymore. I knocked on the door. No answer. Knocked again, harder. After a long pause, the door cracked open just enough for me to see him. Same faded shirt, same too easy smile. He held my bag in his hand like he'd been waiting for me to ask for it. He passed it through the crack and said something about how I should relax, that they were just making sure everything was okay. That word, we stuck with me. He didn't explain who else was inside. He just gave me the grin again and closed the door in my face. I stood on the porch with my bag for a full half minute, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, then walked back to the car. I sent Airbnb the screenshots, the texts, every detail I could remember. They refunded my stay and said they'd pulled the listing. That solved the practical part. What it didn't solve was the memory of walking into what I thought was a safe space, code in hand, only to find someone already inside acting like he owned it. That moment has lodged in my brain in a way I can't quite shake. Now, every time I book an Airbnb, I read reviews twice, 3 times, looking for any mention of hosts being too involved or people showing up unannounced. I check for cameras, I check locks, and I hesitate on the threshold before stepping inside. Because it turns out the part that scared me most wasn't Steve or even Greg. It was realizing how thin the promise of privacy really is. I thought I was walking into a safe rental. Instead, I walked into someone else's territory, and he made sure I knew it. I booked the Boise Airbnb because it was cheap and simple, just a clean place close to campus where I could stay for a week while cranking through a research paper. I didn't care about the decor or atmosphere. I just needed reliable Wi-Fi and a quiet place to think. The listing was vague but straightforward. Private guest suite with bathroom access, 5 minutes from downtown. The pictures showed a clean room with a queen bed, a desk, and a bathroom with a large mirror above the sink. Nothing special, but nothing alarming either. At $70 a night, I wasn't going to nitpick. When I arrived, the host, a man named Mark, met me outside. He was in his late 40s, average build, plain clothes, the kind of person you'd pass on the street and never notice again. He handed me the key code and gave me the usual rundown: Wi-Fi password, trash days, thermostat, where to park. He didn't linger, which I appreciated. I wasn't looking for small talk. He seemed brisk but polite, the type who rented out rooms to cover the mortgage and didn't care about making it a hospitality experience. The room itself was just as advertised. A queen bed with plain white sheets, a small desk and chair shoved against the wall, a dresser that looked like it had come from an IKEA clearance sale, and the bathroom with the large rectangular mirror above the sink. Everything was clean. No weird stains, no smells, no clutter. The Wi-Fi worked, the outlets were accessible, and I had a lamp for late nights. Exactly what I needed. The first couple of days slipped into routine. I woke up early, made coffee from the small Keurig in the corner, and worked on drafts. In the afternoon, I stretched my legs with short walks around the neighborhood or grabbed food from one of the cheap diners nearby. Evenings were the same. Takeout, TV on my tablet, then sleep. The house itself was quiet. Sometimes I heard footsteps above me or the creak of old pipes, but nothing out of the ordinary. On the third night, though, I noticed something that stuck in my head. I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth and saw the mirror above the sink was slightly crooked. Not much, just tilted a few degrees to the left. It was the kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were staring right at it, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I adjusted it back to level, pressed it against the wall, and forgot about it. The next morning, it was tilted again. I tried to explain it away. Old houses have quirks. Maybe the wall wasn't level. Maybe the mounting was loose. The floorboards creaked when I walked. The windows rattled whenever the wind picked up, and the plumbing groaned when the shower ran. A crooked mirror wasn't exactly a crisis. Still, it nagged at me. That night, after showering, I decided to check the hooks. I reached behind the mirror, expecting to feel a nail or a loose bracket. Instead, my fingers brushed against the edge of a hole. Round, cleanly drilled. Not some messy crack in the wall, this was deliberate. I bent down, squinting into the gap. Something inside caught the light. A small glassy circle, no bigger than a dime. My brain stalled for a second, like it didn't want to process what I was seeing. Then it hit me, a lens. I froze, toothbrush in hand, water running in the sink, staring at that tiny reflection. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it was a bolt, maybe some kind of pipe fitting, maybe anything else. But the longer I looked, the less those explanations worked. The angle was too perfect, pointed directly at the shower. I stepped back, chest tight. I didn't touch it again. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo, zoomed in. The image confirmed it, no mistaking it now. A camera hidden behind the mirror. Every thought in my head ran at once. Should I confront him? Should I call the police? Should I act normal and pretend I hadn't noticed? What if he was watching me right then? What if he had been watching since the first night? I forced myself to breathe. I unplugged my laptop, stuffed it and my notes into my bag, and left the light on in the bathroom like nothing had changed. I didn't take anything else, not even the food in the mini fridge. I walked out the door, locked it behind me, and drove downtown without looking back. I ended up in a 24-hour diner, sitting at a sticky booth under fluorescent lights with my bag beside me. I ordered coffee just to have an excuse to sit there. My hands shook as I scrolled through Airbnb's safety page. Buried in the policies was a line in plain text. Hidden cameras were explicitly banned. They even had a hotline number. I called. The person on the other end was calm, almost too calm, as I explained what I'd found. They asked me to email the photo, which I did immediately. Then they told me to leave the property and not return. They promised a refund, said they'd open an investigation, and thanked me for reporting. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. Because the question buzzing in my head wasn't what happens next with the booking? It was, what do I do right now? I sat in that diner until after midnight, nursing coffee I didn't want. Finally, I drove to the edge of town and checked into a chain hotel off the highway. It was overpriced, sterile, and ugly, but when the lock clicked behind me, I felt like I could breathe for the first time all night. The next day, Airbnb followed up with a polite email asking for more details. They said they'd contact the host directly and take appropriate action. I never heard what happened after that, but about a week later, I checked the listing out of curiosity. It was gone. His profile still existed, though. He still had other properties listed under his name, and on one of those, a new review appeared. The guest wrote that the place was fine, clean enough, close to downtown, but something about the bathroom mirror made them uncomfortable. They didn't elaborate, but I didn't need them to. That's when it hit me hardest. If I hadn't reached behind that mirror, if I hadn't brushed my fingers against the edge of that hole, I never would have known. I would have stayed the whole week, showering, changing clothes, going about my life, all while being recorded. Now, whenever I stay in an Airbnb or hotel or any rental at all, I check everything. I tap mirrors to see if they're two-way. I shine flashlights into smoke detectors and alarm clocks to catch any reflection. I cover up anything that seems off. I never wanted to be the kind of person who sees hidden threats in ordinary places, but that week in Boise left me no choice. Because the most unsettling part wasn't the camera itself. It was the silence around it. The ease with which someone could watch without being noticed. The knowledge that I wasn't the first and probably won't be the last. I think about that a lot when I travel. Not in some paranoid, movie-style way, but in the quiet moments, brushing my teeth, turning off the lights, closing the bathroom door. That mirror in Boise taught me something I can't unlearn. Sometimes the only reason you find out is because you happen to look in the right place at the right time. And most people never do. I've always been careful when I travel. I read every review I can find, I double-check the photos, I make sure the host has a history of positive comments, and I never go for the cheapest option. My friends joke about it, saying I act like I'm planning for a crime scene instead of a vacation. But I don't care. I'm a 22-year-old woman who often travels alone, and being cautious isn't paranoia, it's survival. I don't like giving strangers the upper hand, not when I'm sleeping in a place I don't own, in a town where no one knows me. In March of last year, I decided to take a solo trip to Eureka Springs, Arkansas. I had been saving for months, both to get away from work stress and to prove to myself that I could travel alone without leaning on anyone. I'd seen pictures of the town online, narrow, winding streets, steep hills lined with historic houses, quirky little shops, and Victorian architecture that looked like something out of another time. It seemed quiet enough, tucked away in the Ozarks, but also alive with enough character that I wouldn't feel bored or isolated. I scrolled through Airbnb for hours before finally choosing a place. It was a converted carriage house behind a large Victorian home. The photos made it look cozy. Wooden beams across the ceiling, floral curtains, an old iron bed frame. The host's profile was almost too perfect. Dozens of glowing reviews from couples and solo travelers, each one saying how kind, warm, and accommodating she was. The photos of the main house showed a woman in her late 50s or early 60s, always smiling in a way that seemed practiced but still genuine enough. Her description of the property talked about a private retreat with all the comforts of home. Checked every box. When I arrived, everything matched the photos exactly. The carriage house was small but clean, tucked behind the towering Victorian that looked like it had been standing there for more than a century. The gravel driveway wound past the main house and ended at the little building. The front door was painted green and had a brass knocker shaped like a hand. Inside, there was a little kitchen with mismatched mugs, a round table with 2 chairs, and a narrow staircase leading to the bedroom upstairs. The host greeted me when I pulled up. She was just as friendly as the reviews said, though there was something about her that set me on edge. She asked where I was coming from, what brought me to Eureka Springs, and when I mentioned I was traveling solo, I noticed her eyes linger a little longer than felt normal. It wasn't overtly threatening, just too focused, too interested. I told myself I was being overly cautious. People in small towns can just be nosy. The first night went smoothly. I unpacked a little, cooked some pasta, and curled up with my laptop to watch Netflix. The carriage house was quiet except for the occasional sound of wind through the trees. I locked the front door, checked the windows, and went to bed early. The second night is when I started to notice things. Upstairs, the bedroom was small but comfortable, with slanted ceilings and a single window that overlooked the yard. The bed creaked when I sat down, and the floral curtains were thin enough that the light from the street lamp outside bled through. That night, as I was brushing my teeth and heading toward bed. I saw it. A bolt lock on the outside of the bedroom door stopped me cold. The kind of lock you slide across to keep something in, not out. At first, I told myself it must have been leftover from when the place was used for storage. Maybe it was just old hardware that nobody bothered to remove. But even then, it made no sense. Why would anyone need to lock someone into the upstairs bedroom of a carriage house? I didn't touch it. I left the door cracked, telling myself it didn't matter since I was the only one inside. I pushed the thought away, trying not to spiral. Around 2 a.m, I woke up. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the way an old building shifts and creaks at night. But then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps across the wooden floor downstairs. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound wasn't random like a house settling. It was measured, someone walking. I told myself it could be the host checking something, maybe coming into the carriage house for a reason, though I knew how unlikely that was. She had no reason to come in. The footsteps moved across the living room below, then toward the staircase. Each creak of the wood sounded louder than the last. My body locked up as I stared at the bedroom door. The footsteps stopped just outside it. The door was almost shut, just a narrow line of dim light visible through the crack. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear anything, just silence, heavy and waiting. My eyes shifted to that bolt lock on the outside of the door. I couldn't stop picturing it sliding across, trapping me inside. The door shutting, the scrape of metal, and me with nowhere to go. I didn't wait to see what would happen. Moving as quietly as I could, I grabbed my bag, shoved my laptop inside, and went to the window. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me longer than it should have to push it open. The frame groaned as I forced it upward, but I didn't stop. Adrenaline drowned out every other thought. The window opened onto a small roof overhang. I climbed out, scraping my knees against the frame. The shingles were cold and rough under my hands. I crouched there for a second, glancing back at the door, half expecting it to swing shut. Didn't. I dropped to the gravel below, the landing sending a jolt up my legs. My palms were bleeding from the way I'd caught myself, but I didn't care. I sprinted across the yard, past the Victorian house, and onto the quiet street. I didn't look back. At a gas station about a mile down the road, I finally stopped. I stood there under the fluorescent lights, my chest heaving, trying to slow my breathing. I called a rideshare and booked the nearest hotel on my phone. While I waited, I sent the host a short message. I kept it vague. Emergency came up, had to leave early, would message later about checkout. She didn't respond. The next morning, sitting in the hotel lobby with my coffee shaking in my hand, I pulled up the AIRBNB app and requested to cut the stay short. The host replied with a single line, "Sorry to hear that. Hope everything's okay. No questions. No details." I wrote a private review to Airbnb support, explaining what I had experienced. The lock on the outside of the door, the footsteps, the silence that felt like someone waiting. They refunded the unused nights. I never found out what would have happened if I'd stayed. Maybe nothing. Maybe it really was just creaky floorboards and me working myself up over a strange lock. But every time I think about it, I see that bolt in my mind. I see the door half open, the footsteps halting just outside, the quiet that wasn't natural. Now, I don't even unpack until I've checked every door and window in a rental. If I see a lock that doesn't make sense, one that belongs on the wrong side of a door, I leave. No explanations, no apologies. Because locks like that aren't accidents. They're choices. And if someone slides one shut on you, it won't be you who decides when it opens again. I'd been working travel nurse contracts for a few years by then, and I had gotten used to living out of a suitcase. Hotels were fine for short stays, but if the contract stretched beyond a week or two, I preferred Airbnb. A small house or guest suite gave me space to breathe, a kitchen to cook in, and usually more peace and quiet than a hotel with thin walls and drunk guests slamming doors at 2 a.m. This assignment landed me in Fresno, California, last May. The hospital gave me a decent housing stipend, so I booked a single-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a stucco place with a gravel yard out front and a lemon tree in the back. The listing photos showed a queen bed, a tidy little kitchen, and neutral beige walls. It was exactly the sort of place you forget about after you leave, which was fine by me. The first few days were routine. I worked 12-hour shifts, drove the short commute back, reheated leftovers, showered, and collapsed into bed. The neighborhood itself was calm. Sometimes I'd hear sprinklers clicking on or a dog barking somewhere down the block, but nothing out of the ordinary. I barely noticed the place because I was running on autopilot, just focused on getting through my shifts. On my third evening, I had just settled on the couch with a reheated container of stir-fry when there was a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, no deliveries, no host check-ins. Curious, I peeked through the blinds. A man stood on the porch. He wore a polo shirt with an Airbnb logo stitched on the chest and a lanyard badge that looked official. Clipboard under his arm, average build, maybe mid-30s, shaved head. When I cracked the door, he smiled like he'd been waiting for me. He introduced himself as maintenance and said he needed to run a quick smoke detector check. Company policy, he explained. It didn't sound right. I'd stayed in plenty of AIRBNBs, and not once had anyone shown up unannounced mid-stay for an inspection. Usually, if there was an issue, it came through the app, never with someone at the door. But the shirt, the badge, the clipboard, it all looked official enough to make me hesitate. I asked if he had paperwork from the host. He tapped his badge, which had his photo, a QR code, and the name Aaron. From where I stood, it looked real enough. He said it would only take 10 minutes, and before I could fully decide, I found myself stepping aside to let him in. He entered casually, scanning the space like he'd been here before. He started jotting things down on his clipboard almost immediately. His first question threw me off. "You're here solo?" he asked. I said yes, keeping my voice flat. He nodded like he already knew. Instead of heading straight for the smoke detectors, he lingered in the hallway, poking his head into the bedroom and bathroom, tilting his chin upward as if checking the ceiling, though I noticed his eyes sliding toward closets and furniture instead. In the kitchen, he paused at the sliding glass door. He tugged the handle gently, nodded, and scribbled something down. "Old locks," he muttered almost to himself. "Could use upgrading." He never actually tested the smoke detectors, not once. By the time he left, the supposed 10-minute inspection had stretched to nearly 20. My skin crawled with unease. I locked the door after him and stood there, second-guessing everything. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe Airbnb had rolled out some new policy. But it didn't sit right. That night, I checked all the doors and windows twice before going to bed. Around 1 a.m., I woke to a faint rattling sound. At first, I thought it was just the refrigerator cycling or the old house settling, but then I realized it was coming from the kitchen. I slipped out of bed barefoot, phone in hand, and moved quietly down the hall. In the dim light, I saw the back door handle twisting slowly, just enough to rattle against the lock. My stomach dropped. The deadbolt was still set, but the knob lock wasn't. I knew I had locked it earlier. That meant it had been unlocked at some point after I checked it, most likely when Aaron fiddled with it during his inspection. I called the police in a whisper, explaining what I was seeing. The rattling stopped while I was still on the phone. I stood there frozen, clutching the phone, staring at the door like it might swing open at any second. 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up out front. 2 officers searched the backyard with flashlights. No footprints stood out in the gravel, no forced entry. Just me, shaken, standing barefoot in the kitchen. When I explained about Aaron, they exchanged a look. One of them said flatly that Airbnb doesn't send people out like that. Any issue is handled through the host. I pulled up the app right then and messaged the host. She replied almost instantly, alarmed, insisting she hadn't sent anyone. She said she would call Airbnb support herself. The officers wrote up a report and advised me to keep the deadbolt locked. One of them recommended hotels for future contracts. After they left, I dragged a chair under the front door knob, pushed a stool against the sliding door, and sat awake with every light on until morning. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even as I packed my bag, The back of my neck prickled like someone was standing in the doorway. I checked out early, ate the cost of the unused nights, and booked a chain hotel closer to the hospital. I told myself peace of mind was worth more than the refund. Airbnb support eventually called. They apologized, refunded me, but stressed they couldn't confirm who the man was or whether he had any connection to their platform. Basically, a dead end. A few days later, scrolling through a Fresno neighborhood Facebook group, I came across a post that made my stomach knot. A woman described a man coming to her short-term rental, claiming to be maintenance, asking odd questions about whether she was staying alone. Shaved head, clipboard, polo shirt with a logo. The comments were full of speculation. Scammer, burglar, worse. I didn't add my story. What would it change? I'd already learned how quickly someone could walk into your space and leave behind the kind of dread that sticks. A locked door doesn't mean much if the wrong person has already handled it. Ever since then, I travel with a small rubber door wedge in my bag. Costs a couple of dollars, takes up no space, and gives me control over a door someone else installed. I don't care how safe a neighborhood looks or how polite a host seems. That Fresno house taught me that quiet streets and tidy listings don't mean you're safe. I still take contracts. I still move city to city. But now, the first thing I do isn't unpack. It's wedge the doors, check the locks, and make sure no one's been there before me. Because the scariest part wasn't the knock at the door or the rattling in the night. It was realizing how close I came to opening my life to someone who had no reason to be there. Someone who might have been waiting for the right moment. That thought is what kept me awake for weeks afterward, long after I left Fresno. It's the reason I'll never trust a badge or a shirt again without double-checking through the app first. And it's why, to this day, I haven't booked another single-story house with a sliding glass door in the back.